The autumn rain hammered against the wooden slats of the abandoned barn like bullets from heaven, each drop carrying the weight of Emma Carson's shattered dreams. She stood in the doorway, her clothes soaked through to the bone, watching her last earthly possession stumble blindly through the muddy paddock. The horse, a once magnificent chestnut stallion named Thunder, moved with the careful, hesitant steps of the newly blind, his head low, ears swiveling at every sound, as if the world had suddenly become a dangerous maze he could no longer navigate. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma's fingers traced the eviction notice crumpled in her jacket pocket, the ink now smeared but the words still burning in her memory like a brand on her soul. 30 days they had given her. 30 days to find $3,000 she didn't have, to save a ranch that had been in her family for 4 generations, to keep the only home she had ever known from falling into the hands of developers who saw nothing but dollar signs where she saw legacy and love. That had been yesterday. Today she had nothing but a blind horse, $17 in quarters and crumpled bills, and a heart so heavy she wondered how her legs still carried her forward. Thunder nickered softly, a sound that once would have been answered by the gentle lowing of cattle or the familiar whicker of his pasture mates. Now it echoed hollow against the barn walls, met only by the relentless percussion of rain on tin roofing. The infection that had stolen his sight had come sudden and merciless, like so many of the tragedies that had befallen the Carson ranch in recent months. First her father's heart attack during spring roundup, then the drought that withered their summer crops, followed by the string of veterinary bills that had drained their savings down to nothing. The blindness was simply the final cruel joke in a series of misfortunes that seemed to have no end. Emma had sold everything else, the cattle, the equipment, her mother's jewelry, even her father's treasured saddle collection. But Thunder, she couldn't bear to part with Thunder. He had been her companion through childhood adventures and teenage heartbreaks, had carried her across miles of Montana prairie under stars that now seemed as distant as her hopes. When the veterinarian suggested putting him down, speaking in gentle tones about quality of life and practical considerations, something fierce and protective had risen in her chest like a mother defending her young. She pulled her worn denim jacket tighter around her shoulders and stepped into the rain, her boots squelching in mud that seemed determined to pull her down with every step. Thunder's head lifted at her approach, nostrils flaring as he caught her scent. Despite everything, despite the blindness that had turned his world dark, his faith in her remained absolute. His muzzle found her outstretched hand, lips soft and warm against her palm, and Emma felt tears mix with the rain on her cheeks. "I'm sorry, boy," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "I promised I'd take care of you, and look where we've ended up." She had driven through the night, her ancient pickup truck coughing and wheezing through mountain passes and across high desert plains, following half-remembered stories her grandfather used to tell about a place in Wyoming where horses could run free, and cowboys still lived by codes older than civilization. It was a fool's quest, she knew, chasing legends and childhood dreams when what she needed was practical solutions and cold hard cash. But desperation had a way of making even the impossible seem reasonable, and Emma Carson was nothing if not desperate. The truck had finally given up 30 miles back, steam billowing from under the hood like the last breath of a dying animal. Emma had unhitched the horse trailer, checked on Thunder, and made the decision that would define the rest of her life. They would walk. She would lead him down this muddy county road until they found something, anything, that offered even the smallest glimmer of hope. The storm showed no signs of letting up as Emma led Thunder along the gravel road, her hand resting gently on his neck to guide him around puddles and ruts that could send a blind horse stumbling. Every few minutes she would murmur soft reassurances, more for her own comfort than his, because Thunder had always been braver than she was. Even now, sightless and uncertain, he followed her lead with the same trust he had shown when she was 8 years old, and convinced she could teach him to jump over the moon. Miles passed beneath their feet like slow-moving water. Emma's legs ached, her boots had long since given up any pretense of keeping her feet dry, and the cold had settled so deep into her bones that she wondered if she would ever feel warm again. Thunder's breathing had grown labored, not from exertion, but from stress and confusion. This was no life for a horse who had once galloped across open range with the wind in his mane and the world spread out before him like a promise. Just when Emma began to fear they might collapse together on the roadside, victims of her stubborn refusal to accept defeat, she saw it through the curtain of rain, a weathered wooden sign, paint peeling but still legible, that read, "Clearwater Ranch, 2 miles." Below it, in smaller letters that might have been added later, were the words that made her heart skip: "Sanctuary for retired horses." Hope, that dangerous emotion she had been trying so hard to suppress, flickered to life in her chest like the first spark of a campfire. A horse sanctuary meant people who understood, people who might see past Thunder's blindness to the magnificent animal he still was beneath the surface. It meant the possibility, however slim, that she wouldn't have to make the choice that had been haunting her dreams for weeks. The ranch appeared gradually through the mist like something from a fairy tale, or perhaps a mirage conjured by her desperate mind. Rolling pastures stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with horses of every color and description. Some grazed peacefully despite the rain, their coats dark with moisture but their bearing proud and content. Others stood beneath the shelter of enormous oak trees that looked old enough to have witnessed the settling of the West itself. The main house was a sprawling log structure that seemed to grow from the landscape itself, smoke rising from its chimney like a beacon of warmth and welcome. Barns and outbuildings were scattered across the property, with the kind of practical placement that spoke of generations of horsemen who knew their business. Even in the rain, even through her exhaustion and despair, Emma could sense something special about this place, something that made her believe in possibilities again. A movement near the largest barn caught her attention, and she felt her breath catch in her throat. A man emerged from the shadows, tall and lean with the kind of weathered face that comes from spending a lifetime under open skies. He wore a black cowboy hat that had seen better days, a canvas coat dark with rain, and boots that had walked through more mud and manure than most people saw in a lifetime. But it was his eyes that stopped Emma cold, eyes the color of storm clouds, that seemed to see everything and judge nothing. He approached them slowly, his movements deliberate and calm in the way of someone accustomed to dealing with frightened animals. His gaze took in Emma's bedraggled appearance, her obvious exhaustion, and then settled on Thunder with an intensity that made her suddenly self-conscious about her horse's condition. She found herself wanting to explain, to justify, to somehow make this stranger understand that they hadn't always looked like refugees from a disaster movie. "Name's Jake Morrison," he said simply, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to be raised to be heard. "This is my place." Emma swallowed hard, tasting rain and fear and something that might have been hope. "Emma Carson," she managed, "and this is Thunder. I know how we must look, but I swear he's a good horse. He's just—" She trailed off, not sure how to explain the catastrophe that had brought them to this moment. Jake's attention never wavered from Thunder, studying the horse with the practiced eye of someone who had seen every kind of equine ailment and injury imaginable. He took note of the careful way the horse held his head, the slight tremor in his legs from exhaustion and stress, the trust he still showed in the woman who held his lead rope despite whatever trauma had brought them both to this desperate state. "He's blind," Jake observed, and it wasn't a question. Emma nodded, unable to trust her voice. This was the moment when sympathy would turn to pity, when understanding would give way to the same practical considerations every veterinarian and horse person had tried to gently impose on her. She braced herself for the conversation she had heard too many times before, the one that always ended with phrases like "quality of life" and "the kindest thing to do." Instead, Jake walked closer to Thunder, moving slowly and speaking in low, soothing tones that seemed to cut through the storm like a warm breeze. "Easy, boy," he murmured, extending his hand for the horse to catch his scent. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." Thunder's ears pricked forward, the first sign of interest he had shown in hours. His nostrils flared as he took in this new person's smell, processing information in the way horses do when sight is no longer an option. After a long moment, he allowed Jake to place a gentle hand on his neck, and Emma saw something pass between man and horse that she couldn't quite define but recognized instinctively as important. "What happened to him?" Jake asked, his voice carrying genuine concern rather than the clinical detachment she had grown accustomed to hearing. Emma's story spilled out like water through a broken dam. She told him about the infection, about the veterinarians who had done everything they could but ultimately failed to save Thunder's sight. She spoke of the ranch she had lost, the impossible choice between keeping her promise to a horse who had given her everything and facing the practical reality that she couldn't afford to care for him properly. She found herself revealing details she hadn't shared with anyone, about the loneliness of being the last of her family line, about the crushing weight of failing to preserve a legacy that had survived wars and droughts and economic disasters only to die on her watch. Jake listened without interruption, his hands never leaving Thunder's neck, his presence somehow making both horse and human calmer than they had been in weeks. When Emma finally fell silent, wrung out by the telling and shivering from cold and exhaustion, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "How long since he lost his sight?" he asked. 6 weeks, Emma replied. "The infection came on fast, and by the time we realized what was happening, it was too late to save his vision. The vet said he might adapt, given time, but—" She gestured helplessly at their current situation, 2 refugees standing in the rain with nowhere to go and no resources to change their circumstances. Jake nodded thoughtfully, his storm cloud eyes taking in details that Emma was too tired and heartsick to notice. He saw the way Thunder's ears tracked sounds, the careful placement of his hooves as he tested unfamiliar ground, the bond between horse and woman that remained unbroken despite everything they had endured. Most importantly, he saw something in the horse's bearing that spoke of an animal who hadn't given up, who was simply waiting for someone to show him how to live in his new reality. "Come on," Jake said finally, taking Thunder's lead rope from Emma's numb fingers. "Let's get you both out of this rain." He led them toward the barn, and Emma followed on unsteady legs, hardly daring to believe that someone was finally offering help without conditions or judgments attached. The barn was warm and dry, and filled with a familiar sense of hay and leather and horses, smells that had meant home to Emma for as long as she could remember. Jake guided Thunder to a large stall bedded deep with fresh straw, moving with the kind of practiced efficiency that comes from handling horses for decades. "There's grain in the bin there," he told Emma, nodding toward a corner of the barn. "Not too much at first. His system needs to adjust if he's been stressed. Water's in the bucket, fresh as of this morning." Emma wanted to thank him, wanted to express the gratitude that was overwhelming her tired mind. But Jake was already moving on to practical matters with the kind of matter-of-fact kindness that didn't require acknowledgement. He brought clean blankets for Thunder, showed Emma where she could find dry clothes in a storage room that apparently existed for just such emergencies, and disappeared long enough to return with a thermos of hot coffee that tasted like salvation itself. As Thunder settled into his temporary quarters, gradually relaxing as the warmth of the barn seeped into his bones, Emma found herself studying their benefactor with new eyes. Jake Morrison moved through his domain with the quiet confidence of a man who had found his place in the world and made peace with it. There was something in his manner that suggested he understood loss, that he recognized the particular kind of desperation that had driven Emma to his doorstep in a storm with nothing but a blind horse and dreams that had already died. "The rain's supposed to let up by morning," Jake said, settling onto a bale of hay and wrapping his hands around his own cup of coffee. "You can stay the night, get your bearings, decide what you want to do next." Emma felt tears threaten again, this time from gratitude rather than despair. "I can pay you," she said quickly, reaching for her jacket pocket. "I don't have much, but I can give you something for his feed, for the trouble." Jake held up a hand to stop her. "Keep your money," he said simply. "You're going to need it more than I do." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to Thunder explore his new surroundings with careful steps and soft nickering sounds that suggested he was beginning to feel safe for the first time in weeks. Emma found herself studying Jake's profile in the barn's dim lighting, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of long days in the sun and wind, the calluses on his hands that told stories of hard work and honest labor. "This sanctuary," she said finally. "How long have you been running it?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jake's expression grew distant, as if he were looking at something far beyond the barn walls. 7 years now, he replied. Started it after I retired from the rodeo circuit. Figured it was time to give back to the animals that had given me everything. Emma sensed there was more to the story, layers of meaning in the simple words that spoke of personal history she wasn't entitled to know, but she understood the impulse. the need to create something meaningful from the pieces of a life that had taken unexpected turns. In a way, that was what she had been trying to do with the family ranch, though her efforts had ultimately failed. "What kind of horses do you take in?" she asked, genuinely curious about this place that felt like a refuge from a world that had grown too hard and unforgiving. "All kinds," Jake replied. "Old ranch horses whose working days are behind them, former race horses that need a quiet place to retire, animals that have been abused or neglected and need someone to help them trust humans again. Some come here to die with dignity. Others find new purpose they never expected." He paused, his gaze settling on Thunder, who was methodically exploring the corners of his stall with his muzzle. "Blind horses are special cases," he continued. "Most people assume they're automatically candidates for euthanasia, but that's not always true. Horses are incredibly adaptable animals. With patience and the right kind of guidance, many of them can live full, happy lives even without sight." Emma's heart clenched with something that felt dangerously like hope. "But the cost of caring for them," she said, voicing the practical concerns that had been tearing her apart for weeks. "The special attention they need, the safety considerations." "All manageable," Jake said, with the kind of quiet certainty that came from experience rather than wishful thinking. "The real question isn't whether it can be done, but whether the horse has the will to adapt and someone who's committed to helping him learn." He turned those storm cloud eyes on Emma, and she felt as if he were looking directly into her soul. "Thunder's got someone who loves him enough to walk through a storm rather than give up on him," he said. "That's more important than money, or perfect facilities, or anything else people think they need to make it work." Emma stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Are you saying you think he could actually have a life here? A real life? Not just existence?" Jake stood up, brushing straw from his jeans, and walked to Thunder's stall. The horse lifted his head at the approach, ears forward with interest rather than fear. Jake extended his hand slowly, allowing Thunder to catch his scent again, then began stroking the horse's neck with gentle, practiced movements. "I'm saying," Jake replied carefully, "that I've seen miracles happen in this barn. I've watched horses that everyone had written off discover they had more fight in them than anyone imagined. I've seen animals find new ways to be useful, new reasons to get up every morning and greet the day with curiosity instead of fear." He paused, his hand still moving in soothing circles on Thunder's neck. "But it's not easy, and it's not quick. It takes commitment from everyone involved, and there are no guarantees. Some horses adapt, others don't. Some find their way to a new kind of happiness. Others never quite recover from what they've lost." Emma felt as if she were standing at a crossroads, with paths leading in directions she couldn't quite see. One path led back to the practical world of limited resources and impossible choices, where loving an animal sometimes meant letting them go. The other path led into unknown territory, toward possibilities that seemed too good to be true, but too precious to dismiss without consideration. "If I wanted to try," she said slowly, testing the words like a rider testing uncertain ground. "If I wanted to see if Thunder could adapt to being here, what would that look like?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, and Emma could see him weighing factors she couldn't even begin to imagine. This was his sanctuary, his responsibility, his reputation at stake if things went wrong. Taking on a blind horse was never a simple decision, and taking on a desperate woman with no money and nowhere else to go complicated the equation exponentially. "Well," he said finally, "I suppose the first thing would be to see if Thunder can navigate basic obstacles without getting himself hurt. Blind horses need to build mental maps of their environment, learn to trust their other senses, develop new strategies for dealing with the world." He gestured toward the far end of the barn, where Emma could see what looked like a small training area set up with various poles and cones and other equipment. "I've worked with a few blind horses over the years," Jake continued. "Had some success, had some failures. Each animal is different, and you can't force the process. But if Thunder's got the heart for it, if he's willing to learn to trust again, then we could give it a try." Emma felt her breath catch in her throat. "And if he can't adapt? If it doesn't work out?" Jake's expression grew solemn, and Emma knew he was giving her the honest answer that anyone in his position would have to give. "Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it," he said simply. "But I don't believe in giving up on an animal until they've shown me they're ready to give up on themselves." Thunder nickered softly, as if he were participating in the conversation, and both humans turned to look at him. The horse stood quietly in his stall, head raised and ears pricked forward with an alertness that suggested he was listening to every word, processing the tone and emotion of their voices even if he couldn't understand their meaning. "He's still got fight in him," Emma said softly, recognizing something in Thunder's bearing that she had almost forgotten was there. "He's scared and confused, but he hasn't given up." Jake nodded, his weathered face creasing in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "That's what I see too," he agreed. "The question is whether you're ready for what comes next." Training a blind horse isn't just about the animal learning new skills. The human has to learn too, has to become eyes and confidence and guidance all rolled into one. It's a partnership in the truest sense, and it requires more trust and communication than most people ever experience with a horse. Emma looked at Thunder, this magnificent animal who had already given her so much, and was now asking her to believe in possibilities that seemed to exist only in the realm of dreams and desperate hopes. She thought about the ranch she had lost, the legacy she had failed to preserve, the practical realities that suggested she should cut her losses and find some way to move on with her life. Then she thought about the 8-year-old girl who had learned to ride on Thunder's back, who had whispered secrets into his ears and cried into his mane when the world seemed too hard to bear. She thought about promises made and love given freely, about the bond between human and animal that transcended practical considerations and touched something eternal and unbreakable. "I'm ready," she said, and was surprised by the strength in her own voice. "I don't know what I'm doing, and I can't pay you what this is worth, but I'm ready to try." Jake studied her face for a long moment, those storm cloud eyes taking in details that would help him decide whether she truly understood what she was committing to. He had seen too many people with good intentions but insufficient resolve, too many animals that suffered because humans made promises they couldn't keep. But he also recognized something in Emma Carson that reminded him of his younger self, back when the world seemed full of challenges that could be overcome with enough determination and heart. "All right then," he said finally. "We'll start tomorrow morning, see what Thunder thinks about learning to be a horse again. But I want you to understand something from the beginning." He paused, making sure she was listening. "This isn't charity, and it isn't a temporary arrangement where you get to feel better about yourself before moving on to whatever's next. If we do this, we do it right, and that means you're signing up for the long haul." Emma nodded, feeling something settle inside her that had been restless and fearful for so long she had forgotten what peace felt like. "I understand," she said. "And Jake? Thank you. For seeing something in us that everyone else missed, for being willing to take a chance when you don't owe us anything." Jake tipped his hat slightly, a gesture that managed to be both formal and intimate. "Don't thank me yet," he said with a slight smile. "Wait until you see what we're asking Thunder to do. Tomorrow morning's going to be interesting, that's for sure." As if he understood that important decisions had been made, Thunder whickered softly and moved closer to the front of his stall, extending his muzzle toward the two humans who were discussing his future. Emma reached out to stroke his velvet nose, feeling the familiar warmth of his breath on her palm, and for the first time in weeks she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, their story wasn't over after all. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault on the Wyoming landscape, but inside the barn, three souls who had found each other against all odds settled into the kind of quiet contentment that comes from knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, they wouldn't have to face it alone. Dawn broke over Clearwater Ranch with the kind of crystalline beauty that follows a cleansing storm. The air smelled of wet earth and fresh possibilities as Emma stepped out of the small guest cabin where Jake had insisted she spend the night. Her boots crunched softly on gravel, still damp from the previous evening's downpour, and she could hear thunder nickering from the barn, a sound that carried both recognition and anticipation. Jake was already up, moving between the paddocks with the quiet efficiency of a man whose day began before sunrise regardless of weather or circumstances. He wore the same weathered hat from the night before, but his canvas coat had been replaced by a worn flannel shirt that had seen countless mornings just like this one. Emma watched him check water troughs and distribute hay with movements that spoke of decades of routine, each action performed with the kind of unconscious precision that comes from true expertise. "Sleep well?" he called out as she approached, though his attention remained focused on a gray mare who seemed to be favoring her left front hoof. "Better than I have in weeks," Emma admitted, surprised by how true the statement was. For the first time since her father's death, she had fallen asleep without the crushing weight of impossible problems pressing down on her chest. The simple act of having someone else share the burden, even temporarily, had given her the first restful night she could remember. Jake nodded toward the barn where Thunder's occasional whickers continued to punctuate the morning quiet. "He's been calling for you since about 5:30, he said, with what might have been amusement. Blind horses often develop stronger vocal habits. Without sight to confirm their human's presence, they rely more heavily on sound to maintain connection. Emma felt her heart tighten with a mixture of love and guilt. Thunder had always been expressive, but since losing his vision, he had indeed become more vocal, constantly seeking reassurance that he wasn't alone in his dark world. She had been so focused on her own grief over their circumstances that she hadn't fully considered how profoundly the blindness had affected not just his ability to navigate physically, but his emotional security as well. "Is that normal?" she asked, following Jake toward the barn. "The calling out, I mean." "Completely," Jake assured her. "Horses are prey animals by nature. Losing sight makes them feel vulnerable in ways we can barely imagine. Thunder's not just looking for you when he calls, he's checking to make sure his herd is still there, that he's not been abandoned to face danger alone." They entered the barn to find Thunder standing alert in his stall, head raised and ears swiveling toward the sound of their approaching footsteps. The moment he caught Emma's scent, his entire demeanor changed. The tension left his shoulders. His head lowered to a more natural position, and he nickered again, this time with obvious pleasure and relief. "Good morning, beautiful boy," Emma murmured, reaching through the stall bars to stroke his neck. Thunder leaned into her touch, and she could feel some of the anxiety leaving his body as her familiar hands moved over his coat. "Ready to see what today brings?" Jake watched this interaction with the studied attention of a man who had learned to read the subtle communications between human and horse. He noted the way Thunder immediately relaxed at Emma's voice, the complete trust evident in how he allowed her to touch him despite his inability to see her approaching hand. More importantly, he observed Emma's natural instincts in dealing with her blind horse, how she spoke continuously to let Thunder know her location, how she moved slowly and deliberately to avoid startling him. "Good instincts," Jake commented as Emma continued her gentle ministrations. Most people either get overprotective with blind horses, treating them like invalids, or they forget to accommodate the blindness and end up scaring the animal half to death. You're finding the middle ground naturally. Emma felt a flush of pride at the compliment, followed immediately by a stab of doubt. "I've been making it up as I go along," she confessed. "Half the time, I'm not sure if I'm helping him or making things worse." "Welcome to horse training," Jake said with a dry chuckle. "The best horsemen I've ever known spent most of their careers feeling exactly the same way. The ones who claimed to have all the answers were usually the ones you wanted to avoid." He opened Thunder's stall door and stepped inside, moving with the same deliberate calm he had shown the night before. Thunder's ears flicked toward him, nostrils flaring as he processed this new presence in his space. Jake allowed the horse to examine him thoroughly, standing still while Thunder's mobile lips explored his shirt, his hands, even the brim of his hat. "He's cataloging you," Emma observed, fascinated by the thoroughness of Thunder's investigation, building a mental picture from scent and texture. "Exactly," Jake confirmed. "Blind horses become incredibly adept at reading information from their other senses. Thunder's learning to identify me not just by smell, but by the sound of my breathing, the way I move, even the particular blend of soap and coffee and hay that I carry with me." Jake's hands began their own exploration, running knowledgeably over Thunder's legs, checking for swelling or heat that might indicate injury from their long walk the previous day. He examined the horse's hooves, lifting each one to check for stones or signs of bruising, his touch firm but gentle throughout the process. Thunder stood quietly for the examination, occasionally shifting his weight, but showing none of the anxiety that had characterized his behavior for weeks. "He's in better shape than I expected," Jake announced as he completed his assessment. "A little thin, probably stressed from everything he's been through, but fundamentally sound. His hooves need attention, and we'll want to put some weight on him, but nothing that can't be addressed with time and proper care." Emma felt another surge of gratitude toward this man who seemed to see possibility where others saw only problems. "What do we do first?" she asked, eager to begin whatever process might help Thunder find his way back to a meaningful life. Jake was quiet for a moment, his weathered hands still resting on Thunder's neck as he considered their options. "The most important thing is building his confidence," he said finally. "Right now, Thunder's world is shrunk down to whatever he can reach with his nose or feel under his feet. We need to help him understand that he can still move safely through larger spaces, that blindness doesn't have to mean imprisonment." He led them out of the barn to a small paddock adjacent to the main structure. The enclosure was perhaps 50 feet square, surrounded by solid wooden fencing that would prevent Thunder from wandering into danger but give him room to move and explore. The ground was level and clear of obstacles, covered with a mixture of sand and fine gravel that would provide good footing while allowing them to hear his movements. "This is where we'll start," Jake explained. "Small space, familiar boundaries, safe footing. Thunder needs to learn that he can trust his other senses to navigate, that he doesn't need to be afraid of every step he takes." Emma watched as Jake opened the gate and led Thunder into the enclosure. The horse moved cautiously, each step deliberate and testing, his head low as he tried to gather information about this new environment. His nostrils flared constantly, processing scents carried on the morning breeze, while his ears swiveled like radar dishes, tracking every sound from the chirping of birds to the distant lowing of cattle. "Talk to him," Jake instructed Emma. "Constant communication is going to be crucial. Thunder needs to know where you are at all times, needs to hear confidence in your voice even when you're feeling uncertain yourself." Emma began a gentle stream of conversation, describing the paddock, commenting on the weather, sharing her observations about the other horses visible in nearby pastures. She felt slightly foolish at first, talking to Thunder as if he were a person rather than an animal, but she quickly noticed how his ears remained trained on her voice, how his movements became more relaxed as her familiar tones provided an anchor in his dark world. Jake positioned himself at the far end of the paddock, his voice joining Emma's in creating a triangle of sound that would help Thunder understand the boundaries of his space. "The key is patience," he called out. "We're not trying to accomplish anything dramatic today. Just want Thunder to realize that he can move around safely, that there are people here who will guide him through the process." For the next hour, they simply allowed Thunder to explore at his own pace. Emma walked beside him, one hand resting lightly on his shoulder, providing physical contact that reassured him of her presence without restricting his movement. Jake moved around the perimeter, occasionally calling out directions or observations, his voice becoming another landmark in Thunder's growing mental map of the space. Gradually, Thunder's steps became more confident. He began lifting his head higher, relying less on ground-level scent trails and more on air currents that carried information from greater distances. His pace increased slightly, no longer the hesitant shuffle of the night before, but something approaching his natural walk. Most encouraging of all, he began to show curiosity about his surroundings, investigating the fence posts with his nose, pawing at interesting textures in the footing, even nickering in response to calls from horses in neighboring paddocks. "He's starting to trust the space," Jake observed, as Thunder completed his third circuit of the enclosure without stumbling or showing signs of anxiety. "Tomorrow we can introduce some simple obstacles, see how he handles the problem-solving aspect of navigation." Emma felt a surge of hope, so strong it almost brought tears to her eyes. After weeks of watching Thunder withdraw into himself, seeing him begin to engage with his environment again felt like witnessing a miracle. "He seems more like himself," she said wonderingly. "More like the horse I remember from before." "The horse is still there," Jake assured her. "Blindness didn't change Thunder's personality or intelligence, it just forced him to find new ways of expressing those qualities. What you're seeing now is him beginning to adapt, starting to understand that he can still be a horse even without sight." They spent the morning working in short sessions, allowing Thunder frequent breaks to process what he was learning and prevent him from becoming overwhelmed. Between training periods, Jake shared stories about other horses he had worked with, painting pictures of animals that had overcome seemingly impossible obstacles through patience, consistency, and the kind of partnership between human and horse that transcended ordinary training relationships. "I had a mare once," he said during one of their breaks, leaning against the paddock fence while Thunder dozed in a patch of morning sunshine. Lost her sight to an accident, went completely blind overnight. Owner was ready to put her down, convinced she'd never be anything but a burden. But that mare, she had other ideas. Emma found herself leaning forward, hungry for stories of success and hope. What happened to her? Took 6 months of work, but she learned to navigate by memory and sound better than most seeing horses navigate by sight. Eventually started doing therapeutic riding with disabled children. Those kids didn't care that she was blind, and she seemed to understand that she was helping them in ways that had nothing to do with perfect vision. Jake's eyes grew distant, clearly seeing something beyond the present moment. Last I heard, she was still working, still bringing joy to children who needed to believe that limitations don't have to define what's possible. Sometimes the horses that have overcome the most themselves are the best teachers for humans facing their own challenges. Emma absorbed this story, finding parallels to her own situation that went beyond the obvious connection of blindness. She too had felt useless after losing the ranch, as if her identity had been so tied to that place and that role that she couldn't imagine who she might be without them. Watching Thunder begin to rediscover his capabilities was giving her permission to consider that perhaps she too might find new ways of being useful, new purposes that could emerge from the ashes of her old life. As the day progressed, Jake began introducing Emma to the broader philosophy that guided his work at the sanctuary. It wasn't just about providing a comfortable retirement for old horses, he explained, but about creating an environment where animals could continue to grow and contribute according to their abilities and inclinations. Every horse that comes here teaches me something, he said as they watched Thunder explore a new section of paddock with growing confidence. Some teach patience, others teach perseverance. Some show me that what looks like an ending might actually be a beginning in disguise. Emma sensed there were personal stories behind Jake's words, experiences that had shaped his understanding of resilience and renewal. She found herself wondering about his past, about what had brought him to this place and this work. But she also recognized that such confidences would have to be earned rather than requested. "What about Thunder?" she asked instead. "What do you think he might teach us?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, his gaze thoughtful as he observed the horse methodically investigating the perimeter of his enclosure. "Trust," he said finally. "Thunder's going to teach us about the kind of trust that goes deeper than sight, the kind of partnership where both parties have to believe in things they can't see or prove." The afternoon brought new challenges as Jake introduced the first actual obstacles to Thunder's environment. Nothing dramatic, just a few ground poles arranged in a simple pattern that would require the horse to think about his foot placement and trust his handler's guidance through unfamiliar terrain. Emma's role evolved from passive observer to active participant, as Jake taught her the subtle art of guiding a blind horse through obstacles. It required a completely different kind of communication than she had ever used with Thunder before, a constant stream of verbal cues combined with gentle pressure from a lead rope and her own body positioning to indicate direction and pace. "Think of yourself as his eyes," Jake instructed as Emma prepared for their first attempt at the pole exercise. "Your job isn't to control his every step, but to provide the information he needs to make good decisions for himself. He has to learn to trust your guidance while still maintaining confidence in his own abilities." The first few attempts were clumsy, both horse and human struggling to find the rhythm of this new form of communication. Thunder stumbled over the first pole, shied away from the second, and showed clear frustration with the entire process. Emma felt her own confidence wavering, wondering if they were asking too much too soon, if her inexperience was setting Thunder up for failure rather than success. "Breathe," Jake reminded her, his voice calm and reassuring. "You're both learning. Thunder can feel your tension through the lead rope, through your voice, even through the air around you. If you're worried about his ability to succeed, he's going to absorb that doubt and make it his own." Emma took a deep breath, forcing herself to relax muscles she hadn't realized were tense. She thought about all the times Thunder had carried her safely across uncertain terrain when she was younger. All the trust he had shown in her judgment even when she was asking him to jump higher or run faster than felt completely safe. Now it was her turn to show that same faith in him, to believe in his ability to adapt and overcome even when the evidence wasn't yet clear. "Okay, beautiful boy," she said, her voice steadying as she found her center. "Let's try this again. I'll tell you what's coming, and you show me how smart you are." This time, Emma's cues were clearer, her timing better, her confidence genuine rather than forced. She described each pole as they approached it. used subtle pressure from the lead rope to indicate the correct path, and most importantly, celebrated every small success with genuine enthusiasm. Thunder responded to her improved leadership, his ears forward and his steps more deliberate, as he began to understand what was being asked of him. By the end of the afternoon, Thunder was navigating the simple pull pattern with something approaching confidence. He still moved carefully, still depended heavily on Emma's guidance, but the fear had largely left his movements, replaced by a growing trust in the process and the people helping him through it. "That's enough for today," Jake declared as Thunder successfully completed his 5th consecutive trip through the obstacles. "We want to end on a positive note. Let him process what he's learned before we ask for more." Emma led Thunder back to his stall, her heart full of emotions she couldn't quite name. Pride in Thunder's progress, gratitude for Jake's patience and expertise, hope for possibilities she was only beginning to imagine. But beneath all of these was something deeper, a recognition that this day had changed her as much as it had changed Thunder. "Thank you," she said to Jake as they settled Thunder for the night with fresh hay and water. "For believing in him, for seeing what he could become instead of just what he'd lost." Jake tipped his hat in that gesture she was beginning to recognize as characteristic. "Thank you for bringing him here," he replied. "It's been a long time since I worked with a horse that had so much heart, so much willingness to try, even when everything seemed impossible." As Emma made her way back to the guest cabin, she found herself thinking about Jake's words, about heart and willingness and the courage to keep trying when success seemed unlikely. She thought about her own losses, her own fears about an uncertain future, and wondered if perhaps Thunder wasn't the only one who needed to learn new ways of navigating a world that had suddenly become unfamiliar and challenging. The next morning brought clouds and cooler temperatures, but Emma's mood remained bright as she joined Jake for the early feeding. Thunder greeted her with his usual nickering, but there was something different in his manner, a kind of eager anticipation that suggested he was beginning to look forward to their training sessions rather than merely enduring them. "He seems more alert," Emma observed as she stroked Thunder's neck, "more engaged with everything around him." "That's what confidence looks like in a horse," Jake explained. "Yesterday he learned that he could trust his other senses, trust your guidance, and still be successful at something challenging. That knowledge changes everything about how he approaches new experiences." They spent the morning building on the previous day's foundation, introducing slight variations to the obstacle course that would require Thunder to generalize his learning rather than simply memorizing a specific pattern. Jake added curves to the path, varied the spacing between poles, and began asking for changes of pace that would test Thunder's ability to adapt his movement to different requirements. Emma found herself growing more skilled as a guide with each session, learning to read Thunder's body language in new ways, understanding how to provide just enough information to help him succeed without micromanaging his every step. The partnership between them was evolving into something different from what they had shared before, deeper in some ways because it required such complete communication and trust. "You're developing what I call the sixth sense," Jake told her as she guided Thunder through a particularly complex sequence of turns and obstacles. "The ability to feel what your horse needs before he fully realizes it himself. It's something that can't be taught, only developed through this kind of intensive partnership." As the week progressed, Jake began introducing Emma to other aspects of the sanctuary's operation. He showed her how he evaluated new arrivals, determining which animals were candidates for rehabilitation and which were simply seeking a peaceful place to spend their remaining years. He explained his feeding protocols, his veterinary care procedures, and the careful attention to individual personality and preference that made each horse's experience unique. "Running a place like this isn't just about providing food and shelter," he said as they toured the facility's various paddocks and pastures. "It's about understanding that every horse has a story, has needs and fears and hopes that have to be addressed individually. Cookie-cutter approaches don't work when you're dealing with animals that have been through trauma or major life changes." Emma absorbed these lessons eagerly, recognizing that Jake was sharing knowledge that went far beyond Thunder's specific situation. She began to understand that the sanctuary operated on principles that could be applied to human healing as well, that the patient rebuilding of confidence and capability that she was witnessing with Thunder reflected a broader philosophy about resilience and renewal. "Have you ever thought about expanding?" she asked one evening as they sat on Jake's porch, watching the horses graze in the gathering dusk. "Taking on more horses? Maybe hiring help to handle the additional workload?" Jake's expression grew thoughtful. "I've considered it," he admitted. "There's certainly no shortage of horses that need this kind of specialized care. But it would require the right kind of help, people who understand that this work is about more than just horse management. It requires a certain temperament, a willingness to invest emotionally in outcomes that aren't always guaranteed." Emma felt something stir inside her, a recognition of possibility that went beyond her immediate concerns about Thunder's future. What if someone was willing to learn? She asked carefully. What if they didn't come with extensive experience but had other qualities that might be valuable? Jake turned to study her face in the fading light, those storm-cloud eyes reading layers of meaning in her carefully neutral question. "Such as?" "Dedication," Emma replied without hesitation. "The kind of commitment that comes from having loved one of these animals enough to risk everything for their well-being. The willingness to put in whatever time and effort it takes to see them succeed." Jake was quiet for a long moment, and Emma wondered if she had overstepped, if her suggestion was presumptuous given how little time she had been at the ranch. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried a warmth that hadn't been there before. "That kind of dedication is worth more than all the formal training in the world," he said. "Heart can't be taught, but skills can be learned. The question is whether someone with that heart would be willing to make the kind of long-term commitment this work requires." Emma felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the invitation implicit in Jake's words. "What would that commitment look like?" she asked. "Years," Jake said simply. "Not months or seasons, but years of learning and growing and sometimes failing before succeeding. The willingness to start over when approaches don't work, to celebrate small victories while working toward larger goals. The understanding that some horses will break your heart despite your best efforts, and others will surprise you with recoveries you never thought possible." He paused, his gaze moving from Emma to the pastures where his horses were settling in for the night. It would mean becoming part of something bigger than any individual animal or training success. It would mean helping to create a place where healing is possible, where second chances are the rule rather than the exception. Emma felt tears gathering in her eyes as the full magnitude of what Jake was offering became clear. Not just a temporary solution for Thunder, but a potential future for herself. A way of rebuilding her life around work that mattered, surrounded by animals that needed exactly the kind of stubborn loyalty she had always possessed. "I think," she said carefully, "that kind of commitment is exactly what I've been looking for without knowing it. I think this place, this work, these animals, they might be the answer to prayers I didn't even know how to pray." Jake nodded slowly, and Emma caught a glimpse of something in his expression that suggested her answer had been what he was hoping to hear. "In that case," he said, "I think we need to start talking about the future in more concrete terms. Because if you're serious about this, there's a lot more you'll need to learn, and Thunder's just the beginning of the education you'll be getting." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Emma felt as if her life was finally beginning to make sense again. The devastating losses that had brought her to this place were starting to reveal themselves as necessary preparations for something she never could have imagined. Thunder's blindness, her own displacement, the series of apparent disasters that had stripped away everything she thought she needed, all of it had been leading to this moment, this place, this possibility of beginning again. "When do we start?" she asked, and Jake's answering smile told her that the real adventure was just beginning. 3 weeks into Thunder's rehabilitation, the first real test arrived in the form of a violent thunderstorm that swept across the Wyoming plains with the fury of nature unleashed. Emma woke to the sound of wind howling around the guest cabin like a living thing, rain hammering against the windows with such force she wondered if the glass might shatter. Her first thought was of Thunder, alone in his stall, surrounded by sounds that would terrify even a sighted horse. She threw on her rain gear and raced through the storm to the barn, her flashlight beam dancing wildly as the wind tried to tear it from her grasp. Inside, she found chaos. Several horses were pacing frantically in their stalls, whinnying with distress as Thunder crashed overhead like cannon fire. But it was Thunder's stall that made her heart sink. The horse was pressed against the far corner, trembling so violently she could see it even in the dim light, his breathing rapid and shallow with panic. "Easy, beautiful boy," Emma whispered, slipping into the stall despite the danger of being trampled by a terrified animal. Thunder's ears swiveled toward her voice, but his body remained rigid with fear. This was worse than she had seen him since the early days after losing his sight, when every unfamiliar sound had sent him into spirals of anxiety. Jake appeared beside her, materializing out of the storm-darkened barn like a guardian spirit. Water dripped from his hat brim, and his clothes were soaked through, suggesting he had been out checking on other animals when the storm hit with full force. His presence seemed to calm not just Emma, but several of the agitated horses, his quiet authority cutting through the chaos like a beacon of stability. "Been building for hours," he said, his voice barely audible above another crash of thunder. "Weather service says it's going to get worse before it gets better." Some of the older horses remember storms like this one, remember what lightning can do to a barn full of hay and frightened animals. Emma's hand found Thunder's neck, feeling the rapid pulse beneath his sweat-dampened coat. "He's terrified," she said, stating the obvious but needing to voice her fear. "All our progress, everything we've accomplished, it feels like it's disappearing." Jake moved to Thunder's other side, his movement slow and deliberate, despite the urgency of the situation. "Setbacks don't erase progress," he said firmly. "They test it, challenge it, sometimes reshape it, but they don't destroy what's been built on a solid foundation. The question is whether we trust our work enough to see Thunder through this crisis." As if summoned by their conversation, another tremendous crack of thunder shook the building, followed immediately by a flash of lightning that turned the barn windows white for an instant. Thunder reared, his front hooves striking the air dangerously close to Emma's head. Only her weeks of working with him, learning to read his body language and anticipate his reactions, allowed her to dodge aside quickly enough to avoid serious injury. "We need to get him out of here," Emma said, her voice tight with controlled panic. "The enclosed space is making it worse, all the sounds echoing and amplifying. He needs room to move, needs to feel like he has options instead of being trapped." Jake nodded, already reaching for Thunder's halter. "The covered arena," he said. "Bigger space, better acoustics, and we can turn on all the lights so the lightning won't seem so dramatic. But moving him through this storm is going to be dangerous for all of us." They worked together to get Thunder ready, their movements coordinated by weeks of partnership, despite the chaotic circumstances. Emma kept up a constant stream of soothing conversation, her voice the one anchor point Thunder could rely on in a world that had suddenly become unpredictable and threatening. Jake handled the practical aspects, checking the halter fit, planning their route to minimize exposure to the worst of the storm. The journey from barn to arena was only 50 yards, but it felt like miles as they fought against wind that seemed determined to knock them all down. Thunder balked at leaving the familiar barn, then surged forward when a particularly violent gust caught him off guard, nearly pulling Emma off her feet. Rain drove into their faces like needles, and the footing became treacherous as water turned dust into slippery mud. Halfway to the arena, disaster struck. A brilliant flash of lightning followed instantly by deafening thunder caused Thunder to bolt sideways, his massive weight jerking the lead rope from Emma's hands. In his blind panic, the horse charged toward what he couldn't know was a fence line, his flight instinct overriding every lesson they had taught him about careful navigation and trust in human guidance. Emma's scream was lost in the wind as she watched Thunder racing toward certain collision with the wooden rails. Jake sprinted after the terrified animal, his longer stride eating up ground, but even Emma could see he wouldn't reach Thunder in time to prevent the crash that would likely injure or kill the horse they had worked so hard to save. Then something miraculous happened. 20 feet from the fence, Thunder suddenly stopped. Not a gradual slowdown or a stumbling halt, but a complete cessation of movement as if he had run into an invisible wall. He stood trembling in the rain, sides heaving, but alive, and apparently uninjured. Jake reached him seconds later, gathering the trailing lead rope and speaking in the low, calming tones that seemed to cut through even the worst panic. "How did he know?" Emma gasped as she caught up to them, her own breathing ragged from fear and exertion. "How did he know to stop?" Jake's expression was one of wonder mixed with professional satisfaction. "He remembered," he said simply. "All those hours of obstacle work, all that practice in trusting his other senses, it kicked in when he needed it most." Thunder felt the change in air pressure near the fence, heard the different sound his hooves made on the grass versus the harder ground near the posts. His training saved his life. They completed the journey to the arena without further incident, Thunder now following Jake's guidance with the intense focus of an animal that had just learned a crucial lesson about the value of human partnership in a dangerous world. Inside the arena, with all the lights blazing and space to move freely, Thunder gradually began to calm. His breathing slowed, the trembling eased, and eventually he even began to explore his temporary shelter with the careful curiosity that had marked his recovery. Emma sank onto a hay bale, emotionally exhausted by the near disaster and its miraculous resolution. "I thought we were going to lose him," she admitted. "When he bolted, when I lost hold of the rope, I thought everything we'd worked for was about to end in the worst possible way." Jake settled beside her, his own relief evident despite his calm exterior. "Crisis has a way of revealing what's really been learned," he said. "Tonight, Thunder proved that his training isn't just surface behavior that disappears under stress. It's become part of who he is now, part of how he processes the world and makes decisions. That's the difference between real rehabilitation and temporary management." As the storm gradually began to subside, they took turns staying with Thunder, ensuring he never felt abandoned in the unfamiliar space. Emma found herself reflecting on the evening's events, recognizing parallels to her own journey that went deeper than the obvious connection of learning to navigate a changed world. Like Thunder, she had moments of panic when old fears threatened to overwhelm the progress she had made. Like him, she was learning that real strength came not from the absence of fear, but from the ability to function despite it. "Jake," she said during one of their quiet vigils, "can I ask you something personal?" He looked up from the book he had been reading by the arena's overhead lights, his expression encouraging despite the late hour and their shared exhaustion. "Of course. What made you believe in this? In the idea that animals like Thunder could overcome something as fundamental as blindness and find meaningful lives again? Most people would have seen it as kindness to end his suffering rather than put him through this difficult process." Jake was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving to Thunder, who dozed peacefully in the center of the arena. "I suppose," he said finally, "it comes from learning the hard way that what looks like an ending isn't always one. I've seen too many horses written off as hopeless go on to surprise everyone, including themselves. But more than that, I've learned that the process of trying to help them often changes us as much as it changes them." Emma sensed there was more to the story, personal experiences that had shaped Jake's philosophy about second chances and the value of refusing to give up on damaged souls. But she also understood that such revelations came in their own time, couldn't be forced or requested directly. The dawn that followed the storm revealed a world washed clean and sparkling with possibility. Thunder emerged from the arena a changed horse, his confidence seemingly strengthened rather than shaken by his successful navigation of the crisis. The near miss with the fence had proven to him that his training was reliable, even under extreme stress, that he could trust the skills they had helped him develop. Over the following days, Jake began introducing more advanced challenges that would test Thunder's growing abilities in new ways. They worked on navigating uneven terrain, responding to subtle voice commands that would allow Emma to guide him from a distance, and most importantly, learning to work calmly around other horses, despite his inability to see their movements and intentions. "The goal," Jake explained as they prepared for Thunder's first group turnout since arriving at the sanctuary, "is integration. Thunder needs to learn that he can still be part of a herd, still engage in normal horse social behaviors, even without sight. Isolation isn't rehabilitation, it's just comfortable management." Emma's stomach knotted with anxiety as they approached the pasture where 3 of Jake's gentlest horses were grazing. Thunder hadn't been around other animals since losing his sight, and she couldn't predict how he would react to their proximity or how they would respond to his different way of moving through the world. "What if they reject him?" she asked, voicing her deepest fear. "What if they sense his vulnerability and use it against him?" "Horses aren't cruel by nature," Jake reminded her. "They respond to confidence and leadership, not to physical limitations. Thunder's learned to carry himself with authority again. The other horses will sense that and respond accordingly." They began with careful introductions over the fence, allowing Thunder to scent and hear the other animals without the pressure of direct contact. His reactions were positive, ears forward with interest rather than pinned back with aggression or fear. The other horses, in turn, showed curiosity about the newcomer without signs of hostility or rejection. When they finally opened the gate and allowed Thunder into the pasture, Emma held her breath. Thunder moved slowly, methodically exploring this new space, while the other horses watched with alert interest. There was a moment of tension when the herd's leader, an older mare named Sage, approached for the traditional nose-to-nose greeting that establishes social hierarchy. Thunder stood his ground, neither submissive nor aggressive, simply present and confident in his own worth despite his disability. Sage seemed to sense something in his bearing that earned her respect, because after a brief exchange of breath and body language that Emma couldn't fully decipher, she turned and moved away with obvious acceptance. The other horses followed her lead, and within minutes Thunder was grazing peacefully among them, as if he had always belonged to their small herd. "Look at that," Emma whispered, tears of joy making her voice thick with emotion. "He's just another horse in the pasture, not a disabled animal or a special case, just Thunder being himself with friends." Jake's smile was one of profound satisfaction, the expression of a master craftsman watching his work come to fruition. "That's what true rehabilitation looks like," he said. "Not accommodation or charity, but restoration of normal function within the animal's social context. Thunder's not just surviving his blindness anymore, he's thriving despite it." As summer progressed into autumn, Emma's role at the sanctuary evolved from temporary helper to permanent partner in ways that surprised them both with their naturalness. She had proven herself not just with Thunder, but with the other horses, demonstrating the kind of intuitive understanding that couldn't be taught but could be developed with proper guidance and experience. Jake began including her in decisions about new arrivals, asking for her input on rehabilitation plans, and trusting her judgment about which animals might benefit from their specialized approach. Emma found herself growing into responsibilities she had never imagined, discovering capabilities that the crisis with Thunder had awakened, but that extended far beyond her relationship with any single animal. "You have a gift," Jake told her one evening as they watched Thunder playing with his pasture mates, engaging in the kind of gentle roughhousing that indicated complete social integration. "Not just with horses, but with the whole philosophy of this work. You understand that it's not about fixing what's broken, but about finding new ways for individuals to express their essential nature." Emma felt a warm glow of professional recognition that was different from anything she had experienced during her years of struggling to save the family ranch. This work felt like calling rather than obligation, like growth rather than desperate preservation of the past. "I never expected to find something I was truly good at," she admitted. "I thought my talents were limited to maintaining what already existed, not creating something new." "Sometimes our greatest strengths are revealed only when everything familiar gets stripped away," Jake observed. "Crisis has a way of forcing us to discover resources we didn't know we possessed." As autumn deepened into winter, Emma and Jake began discussing the expansion plans they had touched on months earlier. Emma's presence had allowed them to take on additional horses, and her growing expertise meant they could consider more challenging cases than Jake had been able to handle alone. The partnership that had begun as a desperate solution to Thunder's needs was evolving into something much larger and more significant. "There's a horse in Colorado," Jake mentioned one snowy evening as they reviewed applications from owners seeking placement for their animals. "A young stallion, completely blind from birth, never been trained because no one thought it was possible. Owner's been keeping him as a pasture ornament, but she's moving and can't take him with her." Emma's pulse quickened with the familiar mixture of challenge and compassion that had become her signature response to difficult cases. "What's his story?" "Born blind, never handled much beyond basic veterinary care, probably never learned that humans can be trusted partners rather than just sources of food and occasional attention. He's essentially a wild animal who happens to live in a domestic situation. If we took him, we'd be starting from scratch with an animal that's never had any reason to believe cooperation with humans is beneficial." The magnitude of such a project was staggering, but Emma found herself intrigued rather than intimidated. Thunder's success had shown her what was possible with patience, consistency, and the right approach. The idea of helping an animal that had never experienced the partnership between human and horse discover the joy and purpose that relationship could bring felt like a natural evolution of the work they had already accomplished. "How much time would we need?" she asked, already mentally reorganizing schedules and resources to accommodate this new challenge. Jake's grin told her that her response was exactly what he had hoped to hear. "Years, probably. Maybe a lifetime. Are you ready for that kind of commitment?" Emma looked out the window at the pasture where Thunder grazed contentedly with his herd. His blindness now just one characteristic among many rather than a defining limitation. She thought about the woman she had been when she arrived at Clearwater Ranch, desperate and defeated, convinced that loving Thunder meant eventually letting him go. She considered the person she had become, confident in skills she was still developing, committed to work that felt like the answer to questions she hadn't known she was asking. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The paperwork for the Colorado Stallion would take weeks to process, but Emma found herself already planning for his arrival, already imagining the patient work of building trust with an animal that had never learned to believe in human partnership. It would be the ultimate test of everything Thunder had taught them about the possibility of new beginnings, about the strength that could emerge from apparent weakness, about the kind of love that manifests as refusing to accept that anyone is beyond hope or help. That night, as Emma made her final rounds through the barn, she stopped at Thunder's stall as had become her habit. The horse lifted his head at her approach, nickering softly in greeting, and she was struck by how completely normal this interaction had become. Thunder was no longer the blind horse she had rescued, just as she was no longer the desperate woman who had arrived with nothing but love and determination. They were partners now, professionals in their own way, ready to help other souls find their way from darkness into light. "Thank you, beautiful boy," she whispered, stroking his neck one final time before heading to her own rest, "for showing me what's possible when we refuse to give up on each other." Thunder's contented sigh seemed to echo her own sense of completion, of having found the place and purpose that had been waiting for them all along. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new animals to help, new opportunities to prove that love and patience could overcome even the most seemingly insurmountable obstacles. But tonight, in the warm quiet of the barn that had become home, Emma Carson allowed herself to feel the deep satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the most devastating losses are actually preparations for the most meaningful discoveries. Outside, the Wyoming wind sang through the pines, carrying the promise of spring and all the new beginnings it would bring. In the barn, horses dozed peacefully, their dreams undisturbed by worries about the future, because they had learned to trust in the humans who had proven that some promises are kept no matter what the cost. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.